sufficiently huge, whether or not they are on paper, the federal government is kind of the insurer of last resort to look like. Sort of, I do think the government ends up as like the insurer of last resort.
Who do you speak with in the federal government? We speak with a lot of people in the executive branch, and then dozens. What are y'all talking about? What the U.S. needs to do to lead here? How we're going to build enough data centers.
Full of comments saying that we can't allow OpenAI to have a federal bailout. And if one of them fails, hey, it's going to go out of business and the other ones are going to replace it. So nobody is talking about a bailout.
OpenAI is facing absolutely incredible backlash after a leaked letter revealed dramatically different intentions than their carefully crafted public statements. So let's examine what actually started this entire controversy, because this didn't begin yesterday, and it's been an evolving story for several days now that keeps getting more complicated. A few days ago, OpenAI's chief financial officer Sarah Friar stated publicly that the company wants a federal government guarantee to make it substantially easier to finance massive investments in AI chips and data center infrastructure. This statement was made during an interview with the Wall Street Journal, and this represented one of the first times we started witnessing significant public backlash against OpenAI's financial strategy. If you're uncertain why people wouldn't want this arrangement initially, it's because OpenAI operates as a private company, and because they're structured as a private company rather than a public utility, most taxpayers understandably do not want to foot the bill if OpenAI spends excessively on compute infrastructure and other expenses that simply don't make financial sense. Most people don't see any compelling need to bail out OpenAI when they could realistically build their company in a financially sustainable way that doesn't require accumulating $1.4 trillion in cash commitments. There was substantial backlash from this seemingly simple interview clip. The backlash became so intense that what we actually witnessed over the next day was Sarah Friar deciding to publicly clarify the comments she made, issuing a statement on the same day. You can see that she stated, "I'd like to clarify my comments earlier today. OpenAI is not seeking a government backstop for our infrastructure commitments. I used the word backstop and it muddied the point." She continued, "As the full clip of my answer shows, I was making the point that American strength in technology will come from building real industrial capacity, which requires the private sector and the government playing their part. As I said, the U.S. government has been incredibly forward-leaning and has understood that AI is a national strategic asset." Now, whilst this clarifying statement did backtrack somewhat and attempted to clarify what OpenAI kind of meant in that original statement, it still wasn't nearly enough to remove or reduce the continued backlash that we've been witnessing across social media. For example, there was one particularly viral tweet that accumulated over 1 million impressions, 50,000 likes, and nearly 10,000 retweets. This explosive engagement occurred because the narrative started spreading rapidly that OpenAI was essentially asking for a massive government bailout. You can see this person stated bluntly, "So they inflated a bubble by selling undelivered services to each other, and now they're demanding taxpayer money, or they'll crash the economy. This is extortion or intentional economic manipulation." The tweet they're referring to became another major source of backlash for OpenAI. It stated, "OpenAI seeks government spending backing to boost AI investments." The article gets into extensive details, discussing the fact that OpenAI is looking for the U.S. government to provide loan guarantees for its massive infrastructure expansion that could eventually cost more than $1 trillion in total. That's precisely what Sarah Friar was discussing in the Wall Street Journal interview. She explained that federal loan guarantees would dramatically drop the cost of financing, enabling OpenAI and its investors to borrow substantially more money at lower interest rates to meet the company's ambitious targets. The proposal is quite unusual for a Silicon Valley technology giant and would theoretically reduce OpenAI's borrowing costs significantly, since the government would absorb the losses if the company defaulted. Such guarantees would also dramatically expand OpenAI's lender pool, as many banks and financial institutions face strict regulatory limits on high-risk lending. This is coming as OpenAI continues its spending spree on computing infrastructure, and most financial analysts right now have shifted their opinion on OpenAI to start questioning how on earth they're going to pay for the $1.4 trillion in spending commitments they've made until 2030. The backlash got got so intense, there was literally entire Twitter discourse with thousands of people publicly shaming OpenAI's financial strategy. There were countless tweets criticizing the company. If you were on Twitter during this period, you definitely didn't miss this controversy. Sam Altman eventually had to personally clarify exactly what was happening with OpenAI's government relationship. Now remember, I'm going to get to the leaked letter in just a moment, but it's genuinely crazy because I'm giving you the complete backstory on why this letter suddenly became so controversial. When it emerged, Sam Altman stated, "The government has played a critical role in our infrastructure builds. Our public submission posted on our blog shares our thinking and suggestions for how the United States government can support domestic supply chain manufacturing." He continued, "This aligns very clearly with everything we have heard from the government about their priorities. We think United States reindustrialization across the entire stack, from fabrication plants to turbines to transformers and more, will help everyone in our industry and other industries, including us. To the degree the government wants to do something to ensure a domestic supply chain, great. This is part of national policy and that makes sense to me." But then he added crucially, "But that's super different than loan guarantees specifically to OpenAI, and we hope that's clear."
Sufficiently huge, whether or not they are on paper, the federal government is kind of the insurer of last resort to look like. Sort of, I do think the government ends up as like the insurer of last resort.
First resort. Last resort's inevitable, but I'm worried they'll become the insurer of first resort, and that I don't want.
We're going to tell you it's totally hopeless to compete with us on training foundation models. You shouldn't try, and it's your job to try anyway.
The compute constraints that the whole industry has been, and our company in particular, have been terrible. We're so limited right now in the services we can offer. Who wants to make that choice? And so increasingly as we see this, the answer is just much more capacity so that we can serve the massive needs and opportunity with this.
So essentially, he's attempting to say here that OpenAI doesn't really want direct government financial support. It would be somewhat beneficial if they received it, but they're not actively requesting bailouts. But here's the fundamental problem that undermined everything. There was an actual letter that was written directly to the United States government that somewhat contradicts most of the public statements coming from OpenAI executives. And this is where there's a massive public disconnect and substantial distrust from individuals who are basically saying that OpenAI is saying one thing publicly, but behind closed doors, they and the government are trying to work out something entirely different. This is what we see from the leaked documents. It states OpenAI is scrambling to say publicly that they don't want or need a bailout, but just 10 days ago, they sent a letter to the White House asking for things explicitly including loan guarantees.
Who do you speak with in the federal government? We speak with a lot of people in the executive branch, and then what are y'all talking about? What the U.S. needs to do to lead here, how we're going to build enough data set collaboration with other governments, what the economic impact of this is going to look like.
The letter also reveals that the company wants the government to deploy grants, cost-sharing agreements, loans, and more direct financial support. So when this letter was surfaced and started circulating widely on Twitter, people were understandably confused and angry. They said, "Wait a minute, that's absolutely crazy. You guys said publicly that you don't want any loan guarantees. You're backtracking on your statements. And then suddenly we discover this letter that you sent to the U.S. government that explicitly included requests for those very loan guarantees you're now denying." This is the actual letter that leaked. It covers quite a lot of ground across multiple pages. They sent it to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, urgently urging the United States government to act quickly to secure America's leadership by closing what they call the electron gap with China, essentially boosting national energy generation and infrastructure specifically to power AI data centers. The letter goes into substantial detail on many topics, but this is the specific point that most people are paying closest attention to. We can see right here in the leaked document where it discusses AI server production and AI data centers. The letter states, broadening coverage will lower the effective cost of capital, de-risk early investment, and unlock private capital to help alleviate bottlenecks and accelerate AI builds in the United States. Then, crucially, it states, to counter China by de-risking United States manufacturing expansion, To provide manufacturers with the certainty and capital they need to scale production quickly, the federal government should also deploy grants, cost-sharing agreements, loans, or loan guarantees to expand industrial base capacity and resilience. Essentially, they're arguing that to counter foreign nations, we need to ensure that the government is partnering with private companies on this. And I understand what they're saying to some degree. You don't want to fall behind other nations because it would be strategically problematic if you fall behind in the AI race and other nations become the technological leaders in this space. They would have a tremendous economic and military advantage. But I do think there is an important fine line, as Sam Altman himself said, between having federal loan guarantees specifically for private companies versus actually just having the United States government support traditional AI infrastructure as a public good. We then got AI czar David Sachs saying that there will be no federal bailout for AI companies after the CFO's controversial comments. David Sachs, who is President Donald Trump's artificial intelligence and crypto czar, stated, "There will be no federal bailout for artificial intelligence companies."
Full of comments saying that we can't allow OpenAI to have a federal bailout. And if one of them fails, hey, it's going to go out of business and the other ones are going to replace it. So nobody is talking about a bailout. And I think that the goal here is to enable a rapid infrastructure build out without increasing residential rates for electricity. Talking about bailout, we are talking about making permitting easier and making it easier to do build out. A day where they brought in a relatively small number of investors and kind of gave us all an update on their product roadmaps, like you're talking about. And then third and closely related is that agents will have the ability to use tools. OpenAI just launched the audio API, which developers can use. It's in private beta. We have some companies.
His comments came directly after Sarah Friar mentioned a potential backstop during that conference. Now, I personally believe that even if they say this publicly, they are ultimately going to bail out these companies if they face financial trouble. Because at this point, I believe that these companies have become too big to fail economically. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.